now I'd love to jump forward a bit. Obviously, Avatar 2 or Avatar The Way of Water just came out late last year in December. This is one of the biggest movies yet. Obviously, it's James Cameron coming with another just like magnum opus of his. I would love to talk about your collaborative process, and maybe it even makes sense as to go back to 2009 when Avatar, the first part, came out. When were you first approached for that film, and what did it look like?
Well, I first worked with Jim on Titanic, so he knew my work. We knew each other. His producer, John Lando, and I knew each other. I met John way before I met Jim on Hoffa, so we had some professional relationship. I think on the first Avatar, it was very interesting because another costume designer started the movie and then left the project. And at that point, because it's a CG movie, which it clearly has beyond the boundaries of that now, I think there was an expectation that maybe you didn't need a costume designer. Maybe the CG artists could do it. So while they were sort of involved in live action, they kind of let it go a little bit. That one day I got a call from John Lando, and he always says, he woke me up, and he did. It was quite early in the morning, and I was like, and we, like I said, we've been friends for quite some time. I'm like, hello, and he's like, Deb, what you up to? I'm like, I haven't even had a cup of coffee yet. What do you need, John? And he said, how would you like to come over? And he lived not too far from me. How would you like to come over and look at some of the stuff we've been up to down in New Zealand? Because at that point they had already gone to New Zealand. And I'm like, absolutely. When? He goes, how about now? And I'm like, well, so I jumped out of bed, got dressed really quick, ran over, acted like, of course I'd been up for hours. And he showed me this amazing footage. And it was absolutely spectacular. And beyond anything I'd ever seen before, I didn't know, I didn't even understand what I was looking at, really, except it was beautiful. And he goes, so Jim was saying, we have an issue. We want to, we thought you'd want to come and help us on this one costume for Sigourney. And I'm like, sure. And he goes, we're leaving tonight. And I was like,
for New Zealand?
Yes. Here's the other tip to anybody in the film business. Have your passport up to date. It's really important because it might come up. So we jumped on a plane that night, and I hadn't seen Jim since, probably the Oscars for Titanic. And it was just like old home week in the old lounge of Air New Zealand. And we got on the plane, and I went down there. I'm like, hold up a minute. What am I doing? What do you need from me? And so we sort of discovered through a long process, and I ended up, you only had to be here a couple weeks, one costume, that's it. I was on the movie for a year and a half after that.
Wow.
And a lot of that was following through the post-production, where I think Jim and John and myself included realized that these costumes that were being rendered through a computer process absolutely needed to be made. That the endless bounds of the artists couldn't quite capture a real garment the way he wanted it to be.
Yeah.
So I made a lot of things. We kind of backtracked a little bit. In a movie like that, you have a long time to sort of get things right. And so we did that. And then, what was the question?
Yeah, well, just kind
right?
of pick up what you were saying is even on the new one, and correct me if I'm wrong, I saw that you 3D printed, or maybe not 3D printed, but created a lot of this stuff for, what is the water tribe for the Na'vi called?
The Metkaina.
Yeah, you created a lot of that, and then it would be brought into the film. So I guess maybe let's use Titanic and Avatar, the difference between shooting a live action film, which Avatar is still, but rather than having everything built and being put into the CG post process. What does that look like?
It's it's far more complicated than anything I've ever done, even the first Avatar. The Avatar Way of Water is a much bigger film. It's got way more characters. They have way more costume changes. The whole visual is just exploded. I'm sure many of your viewers have seen the movie already and sort of understand what I'm talking about. The addition of different clans, the world building that we did with Jim. And the process is, in terms of design, is exactly the same. Read the script, understand the characters, work with the director, work with the production designer, whatever it is. Get the ideas going in your head, put them down on paper. I worked with a lot of illustrators, a lot of designers on this project who were very apt at working with a computer because that's sort of the pipeline, right? But Jim and I actually are really old school together, and I printed like crazy so that we could look at here's a bunch of designs possibly for an ATRE. Mix and match. You can see them all together. In a computer, it's really hard. It's not hands-on. So, and then it started with the process of I had a lot of things in front of me. Performance capture, which was completely new to me. Performance capture underwater, which had never been done before, and that I was expected to help make those suits to accomplish them being able to film underwater. So I was doing that.
Oh wow!
Yeah, that was a whole deal, and no one had ever done it, right? So it was all new. And the first day, the technicians that are developing all the little markers, and I'm sure people are familiar with what performance capture on a dry set looks like. It's the same thing, but you have to make it in an underwater suit. So that presents a bunch of problems. So the first day that the first day I did that, the technicians walk in and they sort of plop these it looked like Christmas lights, when you take your Christmas lights out of storage and like, oh my God, it's just a blah. Yeah. So I'm like, and you need what? It's like, we got to figure out how to put these on this person underwater. It took about, I think probably 7 months to get to a very viable suit that now you see in a lot of the stills of the movie that are sleek and silver and you can move. And the first ones were, they look like Michelin men. They could barely move their arms and legs. Absolutely was never going to work because you need that articulation of the body. We even had sensors on toes because they're barefooted. So the articulation that the camera can pick up on just toes wiggling in the water is amazing. Mm-hmm. So that was one thing. I also had preparing for live action. All the live action costumes that we built, every single one of them, all the props, all the masks, all the breathing masks, all the helmets, all that. So by that time, most of my team was working from Weta Workshop in New Zealand, which is an incredible artist collective is the best thing I can say about it. And I was lucky enough to be asked to enter their premises and work there with them I've been there off and on for 5 years now. So it's pretty rare for them. They live, everyone thinks New Zealand's so far away, but it's really not. But they worked generally with getting kind of contracts from overseas and then delivering back, sometimes never seeing the designer. I'd worked there briefly on my Spider-Man, and I'd worked there on the first Avatar briefly. So I knew what to expect, and I was really, again, the amount of people there that can make pretty much anything you wanted. And we started this whole process of understanding the designs, understanding the language of the people that we were creating, understanding the characters, the family, the clan, the world. And we went through this, started producing costumes like crazy because we knew we were going to need them. We also did extensive testing so that any kind of costume, if Jim is a madman for proof of concept, it's like, is that going to work underwater? Yes. Is it? I'll show you. So it becomes very much a hands-on situation. A lot of work in pools all over the country. And we also did, wind tests, like that'll never stay in her hair. Yes, it will. Let's test it. Let's turn that Ritter fan up so high that your skin's basically blowing off. But,
So he likes to make sure that everything works, even though it's going to be put into a digital space. 100%. He wants to know that in a practical use scenario, it will be what we represent on screen.
Absolutely. And
That's
I
impressive.
think it's impressive. And I think it speaks to his authority in what's real. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And then he can say, you can't fault anything in the movie because it could be that way. It happened that way. We proved that. Everything is real. The real people, the 9-foot-tall blue people, everything and anything. And especially with the costumes. We were probably the only department, and my department sort of reached out into props. We did all the hand props. We did, like I said, the breathing mask for live action. We did all the hand props for the Na'vi. I did all the hair. I did a lot of the body art, almost all the body art and things like that. So, given that absolute amazing opportunity to create these characters from head to toe, but also with the sense that they were going to be real. And I think that's why when you see the movie, along with all the work of the digital artists, it looks so real.
And where did you pull the inspiration for Avatar? Did that start before you being brought on for the original one, or did you get to have some pull going into the second one specifically? This is the inspiration, at least for the water Navi.
Yeah, having the first movie, there was a template for how the Omatakai clan lived, what their basic kind of costume rules were, the rules of their society, and so that was a good start. And then branching into the second clan, extremely important to me and to Jim that they are different peoples. Right? We didn't know at the time. It was still being developed how they would look physically different. All that adaptation to the water, that they have the fins and the eye membrane and all that, that's very incredibly scientifically thought out from his point of view. Again, proof of concept all the time. So don't ever try to fake it, because you'll be caught and you'll be asked and you'll have to prove it. So we did. And that was actually a really fun part of it, because it wasn't just, let's make something pretty. Let's make something pretty that also functions in the way it needs to. So he would have me do tests with, and it informed the design, back and forth, because I would do tests with different kinds of fabrics or materials or different plant things underwater, look at how they flowed. Did they flow right? Were they neutrally buoyant? Were they too buoyant? Did they how many beads weighs it down too much? Jim's a lover of motion and costume. I always say that, and I am too. It gives the costume life. So when you see the characters swimming, and even when you see them on dry land, things moving a little bit in the air, in the wind, the waves, it gives a reality base to what is really true. And the simulators and the animators, having never worked with these kind of garments, because there were one-of-a-kind, bespoke, unique pieces, that they had to understand what that was too. So we had an enormous task. But back to your question, which was, when I came on the second one, there was the idea of this water clan. We knew a lot of rules about Pandora. It was warm. I personally researched all around the world, island peoples, because you want to get okay, what do you learn from research? You learn a lot of things. You learn how people live, what their priorities might be as a culture, what makes culture. That sounds like a vague term, but it's really true. That people who are indigenous peoples are very handcrafty. They're very talented with their hands, because they have to be. They had to be all through history. That they use their environment to create their clothing, and they're quite often very decorative. And this is true all over the world. He knew that he was going to settle down in this sort of greater Polynesian area that he's talked about many times.
And do you turn to photographs or any art books specifically when you're trying to craft this stuff, or is it just general research that you do on the internet? How do you get a lot of the information that you use to transfer into your films?
Well, anyway, the library, even going back to the library, going back to any movie you might have seen that you're like, that'd be really interesting. How did they do that in Tarzan? Anything that can inform you in any way so that you can get to your design premise. We are lucky that we have the internet now. It can be evil because sometimes it's incorrect. So it's like being a lawyer. You got to double check your facts. Yeah. So you have to do that. But we're very lucky in a time period when in the past, I would be doing much more library research. We bought a tremendous amount of books from incredibly beautiful books of peoples all over the world, artists, people, just craft books. It was an incredible learning experience, because I did not know anything about carving, sculpting, particularly. I never done those things. I didn't really know about macrame. I mean, everybody macrameed at some point, but it wasn't the same as people who are really going to do that for you.
Yeah.
Right. So then I was really lucky to assemble an incredible group of people who we learned the language of the movie and what we wanted to do with it almost as we went along.
And what did the process, everyone knows Cameron as being this really, he knows exactly what he wants. Was he there every step of the way with you as the costume designer, approving it, or did you get to have a lot of leeway? In addition, working with like Russell Carpenter, what was it like working with the cinematography department and just making sure that it all like meshed together?
Yeah, the hardest thing on a film of this size and scale is meshing together.
Yeah.
Because everyone's off doing, oh my God, I got a ground break on this, how to light a virtual whatever. I got to, everyone's so busy. Everyone's department is so enormous. And mine being really the only one that actually made full things that actors could wear. The sets were sometimes a little partial, but they're all those crazy set builds for performance capture. Then in New Zealand, we had the live action sets. But what we were doing was like its own unique little space. So Jim would often, yes, of course, you have a lot of approvals. Sometimes it's practical, like we talked about, all this testing, and sometimes it's just aesthetic. We had many meetings about hairstyles, for example. Like here's what I had to offer you, Jim. I'm thinking this character could be X, Y, or Z. When I started on the project, the initial drawings for Sigourney as her character of Kiri, she had very long braids. She looked like a lot like Neytiri. Well, I changed that. So through a process, we got into this kind of feathery, short haircut that much better represented her character, I think. And Jim thought, and Sigourney thought. So that worked out really well. But there's all those approvals, and then there's great lengths of time where Jim would be incredibly busy with something else, and you had to just go forward. That you're not necessarily, no one holds your hands, your hand on big projects like this. You have to be confident to go forward, and if you make a mistake, you back up and you start over. And that's also the beauty of these kinds of films, that there is a tremendous long post-production, which, again, as a costume designer, getting a seat at that table was incredibly important, so that my designs, my costumes, all the information that I could feed to the VFX house, they had to show back to me. Right? We had to have then a dialogue, which is probably new for them, to have it on a daily basis too, where I was doing all the fittings with them virtually, transferring a human-made costume to a tall person, and getting all of the look, the feel, the movement of the costumes correct with them. So that was an incredible part of the process.
And how do they actually transfer the costume into the digital space? Do you know what that process looks like?
Well, they, from my point of view, from what we do, the first thing they do is they take in all the information, right? They take in the 2D art, which is usually front, back, side. They take in a template that's sort of a proportional look, even though we didn't know when we were making the initial drawings what the characters were going to look like physically. The teenagers, the children, how big were they going to be? So it was a little bit back and forth on that, and it took a long time to get to the very end of it. But then they scan all the costumes, all the samples get scanned in their magic technological computer, and then they turn their artists loose on it, right? And they do 3D turntables. Sometimes it's not 3D roundy round, sometimes it's just, full front, your back. And, I'd have to advise them. Sometimes it'd be like, okay, I know that looks on my drawing. That's where the drawings become really important, too, for proportion. Because the costume garment could be, if you put it on a 6-foot-tall man or a 3-foot-tall, toddler, it fits completely different. So the fit, very tailored to the bodies of the digital characters.